So there are a few arguments for the existence of God. Notably, we have the cosmological argument. That's the idea that there has to be some unmoved mover. And then we also have the teleological argument. This is going to be the idea that there has to be some intelligent designer. This video instead is actually going to be focusing on what's known as the Pascal's wager, the idea that it's in your best interest to be betting on God. All right, so in the first segment, we're going to talk about, just how to make decisions about things we're uncertain of, how to use decision matrix. And then in the next segment, we're going to apply those decision matrix to the idea of betting on God. And then we'll look at some possible objections to using the decision matrix, like how we fill it in, the likelihood of God existing, or even just, the lack of a guarantee that heaven exists. And then finally, we will consider another objection that essentially it's impossible to force yourself to believe in God. Even if you are convinced by the argument that it's in your best interest, you still might not be able to, force yourself to believe that God exists. So to give you a little idea of how this is going to go, let me give you an analogy. Suppose you walk into a casino and you are sitting down at a roulette table. And you notice that the odds at this roulette table are going to be a little bit different than the odds at a normal roulette table. So at a normal roulette table, it's going to be 2-to-1 odds for red and black. But at this one, the odds for betting on red are going to be 2-to-1 like normal. But the odds for betting on black are going to be 1 to 1 million. And so, that's not very normal. It's a much higher expected, payoff for betting on black than the normal payoff. And so, you look around at the table, you see it's a totally normal roulette table. It just has these weird odds, like the ball has been landing 50-50 on black and red, but still, they're paying out a lot more when it lands on black. And so even though you're not sure which one the, roulette ball is going to land on next, you still should have a clearer understanding of what the better bet is going to be. So to make this chapter analogous to betting on God, believing in God is not going to cost you very much, but you then become eligible to win the jackpot, eternal life. So that's going to be the same as betting on black. So before we can get to the betting on God argument, we need to just talk about how we can make decisions in an unexpected world, when we're uncertain about the outcomes. So to help us make sense of this, we need to talk about expected utility calculations. So maybe you're not a gambler, maybe you're not familiar with the game of roulette, so let's talk about something that is a little bit more relatable. We all have feelings for other people, and maybe you've had a crush on someone at some point. And now imagine that you're at a party and you see your crush, and you're deciding, should I go talk to them? It could be a him or her, but let's just say him in this case. And it's like, should I go talk to him and confess that I have a little crush on him? And so to make a smart decision, we need to consider a few different things first. So the first thing we need to consider is the possible options and the possible outcomes. So our options are you can talk to him or not talk to him, and the outcomes are that he's going to like you and be into you, or he's not going to be into you. Second, we need to think about the costs and benefits of each one of the scenarios. You talk to him and he's into you, and what's the costs and benefits of those. So in this scenario, if you confess your feelings and he is into you, then you've won big. You get to date your crush. That's awesome. If you confess your feelings and he's not into you, then you probably have some mix of embarrassment that he turned you down, but maybe also some pride that you had the courage to even take that risk in the first place. But then if you don't confess your feelings, but he actually is into you too, then you seem to have missed a huge opportunity. And if you don't confess your feelings and he's not into you, then it's, bullet dodged. Right, so to make the rational decisions, the third things we need to be considering is, how good and bad are the costs and benefits for each possible outcome? maybe it's clear that one of them is more favorable to the others, but it's going to be different for every person. And remember, the actual amount doesn't matter. It's really how much they are relative to each other. So we'll get into that when we're looking at the decision matrix. So finally, you need to take into account the likelihood of each possible outcome happening. If you're not sure that your crush likes you back, then maybe you shouldn't take the risk of embarrassment. But if you've been hearing reliable rumors that, he does like it, then it's not maybe as much of a risk. And so definitely worth trying. So these are decisions that we make all the time. Whether we're thinking about, bringing an umbrella around all day when we're unsure if it's going to rain or not. Or, if you're about 5 minutes away from your apartment and you realize, oh, did I lock the door? And you have to do your expected utility calculation in your head to figure it out. Or, when you're thinking about a movie, like, should I go see this movie? And you're just not sure if it's going to be a good one or not. So we actually do these kinds of calculations all the time, and we don't have to crunch the numbers. But still, the expected utility calculations can make it clear why we should be betting on God. So to help us illustrate how to make these decisions, we can create what's known as a decision matrix. So a decision matrix is essentially like a little spreadsheet. And the rows are going to represent the available options, and the columns represent the possible outcomes and their likelihoods. And then each one of the different eventualities are going to go into the squares in between the outcomes and possibilities. So those eventualities are going to be given a numerical value based on their rankings. And again, the actual numerical value doesn't matter very much. It's just a matter of like how much they are relative to each other. So for the crush case, we can rank the eventualities as follows. So 4, you confess your feelings and he's into you. So that's a 4. That's like the highest possible one you can get. And then a little bit below that is you don't confess your feelings and he's not into you. That's the dodging the bullet one. Number 2 is going to be that you confess your feelings and he's not into you. So that's a little embarrassing. And then number 1 is you don't confess your feelings, but he is into you. That's missing out on that big opportunity. So now let's just suppose that you've been hearing some good rumors. He maybe likes you. I don't know. We'll see. But so you think it's like a 75% chance that he does like you. He also has been acting like it, wanting to walk you home and, being very nice. So let's look at the decision matrix. Let's put this into our little spreadsheet here. In our first column, we have our options. We have confess your feelings or not confess your feelings. And then in the first row here, you can see on the top, you have your possible options. He's into you, he's not into you. And, we said that there's good rumors that he's into you and he's been acting like he's into you. So there's a 75% chance that he's into you and a 25% chance he's not into you. All right, so then you have the squares in between where these two options and outcomes meet, and those are the eventualities. All right, so, and we've already ranked those eventualities, so confess your feelings and he's into you, that gives it a 4. Confess your feelings and he's not into you is a 2. Don't confess your feelings and he's into you is a 1. Don't confess your feelings and he's not into you, that's a 3. All right, so then we've added an extra column here for expected utility. This is where we're going to do the math to figure out which choice has the higher expected utility. So expected utility can be thought about in a few different ways, but one way of thinking about it is going through the same scenario over and over again. So you're at the party, you see your crush, you have all this evidence, and if you did that over and over again with the same evidence, same party, same scenario, over and over again, same crush, all the same, 75% of the time he's going to be into you, and 25% of the time he's not going to be into you. The fact that confessing your feelings has an expected utility of 3.5, and that not confessing your feelings has an expected utility of 1.5 is going to tell us that confessing your feelings is clearly the better choice. All right, but where did those calculations come from? Well, what we do is to calculate that, you need to take the expected utility from the top row and multiply it by the value in the top row in the first column by the likelihood associated with that column. So essentially what you do is you take your first eventuality and you're going to have to multiply it by the chance that that outcome actually happens. So in our first box we have a 4, and so then you go up to the top row and you see what the possibility or the likelihood of that outcome happening, and you multiply the numerical value of the eventuality by the possibility of that eventuality actually happening. So then you do the same thing in the next row. So you multiply the value in the top row, or in the next column, and you multiply the value in the top row by the second column by the likelihood associated with that column, and then to get the expected utility for the option of confessing your feelings, you need to add those two options together. So essentially what we get here is you confess your feelings is equal to 0.75 times 4 plus 0.25 times 2, and so that's going to give us the outcome of 3.5. So again, that is the possibility of the outcome happening is 75%, and that eventuality is going to be a 4. We already ranked it a 4, and then that's added together with the other eventuality where you confess your feelings and he's not into you. So that is a 25% chance, and you gave that a ranking of a 2. So then if you don't confess your feelings, the other alternative, that's going to come out with 0.75 times 1 and added to 0.25 times 3. Again, the possibility of that outcome happening times the eventualities ranking. Added together with the two outcomes, you get your expected utility. So the precise numbers here don't really matter. What really matters is the proportions between the numbers, the ratios between them. So as you can see, 3.5 is, twice, almost, or a little bit more than twice as much as 1.5. So we should say that your expected utility calculations is going to be twice as much if you confess your feelings as if you don't confess your feelings. So we can use this decision matrix to help us establish an argument for confessing your feelings. So here's the argument for confessing your feelings. CF1, one should always choose the option with the greater expected utility. CF2, confessing your feelings has the greater expected utility than not confessing your feelings. CF3, so you should confess your feelings. So CF1 is pretty plausible since the decision matrix tells us that your expected utility calculations do a good job of selecting the rational choice. CF2 here relies on us filling in the matrix correctly. So have we actually filled in the eventualities and the percentages correctly? If we have, then we can see that their confessing your feelings is going to have a higher expected utility than not confessing your feelings. And so then you should accept the conclusion that if essentially if you've done the calculations correctly and you believe that this decision matrix is a good way of making rational decisions, then you should confess your feelings. That has a clearer, higher expected utility. So before we go on, we should know that the numbers in the decision matrix can and probably should change. So remember, what is important is the ratio between the numbers. In current matrix, we began with the rejection being twice as bad as being liked. But maybe that's not you. Maybe you're really afraid of rejection. And so maybe it's more like 100 times worse if you were rejected than if you were liked. So then we can adjust the matrix to reflect that. So we can say, if you confess your feelings and he's into you, that's a 100, but it's 100 times worse if you confess your feelings and he's not into you. You are terrified of rejection. You're terrified of embarrassment. So you can see that, if this is the case, and then, we give the not confessing your feelings, that's avoiding the embarrassment, high marks as well, 98 and 99. Then, you can see the expected utility calculations are also going to be a little different here. We have 75.25. And then if you don't confess your feelings, we have 98.25 as well. Now this decision matrix is going to tell us that confessing your feelings is not preferable to staying quiet. And so in this case, if you are that afraid of rejection, then it's clearly preferable that you stay quiet. Now, obviously, this model is going to be very oversimplified. There are a lot of other possible outcomes. There are also more options that you can add in here. So to adjust that, we can add more rows and columns. So let's consider this, possibility, or this new decision matrix that's been adjusted. You can confess your feelings, or you can keep flirting with him but not actually confess your feelings, or again, you can just avoid him and not confess your feelings. The possible outcomes are that he's into you, But then you also might be, oh, he privately rejects you, doesn't say anything, or it could be much worse, and he could, publicly reject you, which would be incredibly embarrassing. So now all you have to do is figure out a weighted ranking of the different eventualities, estimate the likelihood of each outcome happening, and then crunch the numbers, and then you will have the expected utility calculations, and from that you should be able to know what you should do. So now we can use the same reasoning for making an argument that we should be betting on God. So the argument can be formalized as follows. BG1, one should always choose the option with a greater expected utility. BG2, believing in God has a greater expected utility than not believing in God. BG3, so you should believe in God. BG1 is the exact same as CF1. If you think that expected utility calculations are a good way of making rational decisions, then it would be weird and pretty unprincipled to say that we shouldn't be using them in this instance. And BG2 is justified when we construct a decision matrix. So let's consider the following matrix. Since we don't know if God exists or not, we should assign equal probability to both, 50-50 here. And then we need to fill in the eventualities. We need to rank them. So the lowest eventuality will score a 1. That's not believing that God exists when in fact he does. Presumably that means that you're going to go to hell. You're going to get some eternal punishment of some sort. The second lowest eventuality that we are ranking here, we're going to give it a 2, and that's because this eventuality is that you do believe in God, but he doesn't exist. And so this is going to be essentially seen as a waste of time, going to church, praying, living this upstanding lifestyle, when you really didn't have to. So slightly better is going to be a number 3. We're going to assign that to the eventuality in which you were an atheist and you were also correct about it. So that is, you get the benefits of the atheistic lifestyle, not going to church or living an upstanding lifestyle, but you also are not punished in the end by going to hell, because there is no hell, there is no God. That's the idea. All right, so then the top score in this decision matrix is going to go to the eventuality where you believe in God and God does turn out to exist. And we give this value infinity rather than a 4, and it's because the idea is that the amount of pleasure that you will receive in eternal afterlife is going to be infinitely greater than anything that you would receive in any of the other eventualities. All right, so now how do we do the calculations here? Let's do the not believing in God calculation first. It's a little bit easier. So we have, it's 50-50, so we have 0.5 times 1 added to 0.5 times 3. And so that's going to give us a half and 1.5, and that's going to give us, added together, is going to give us a 2. So then we consider the eventuality, or the expected utility calculations for actually believing in God. So again, it's 50-50, so it's 0.5 times infinity added to 0.5 times 2. 0.5 times 2 is a 1, but what is 0.5 times infinity? So that's like a really tough thing to think about, but let me give you a little example here. So we have the natural numbers. That's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? All the way on, it keeps going for infinity, right? That set is supposed to be infinitely long. Now, if we took that set and we took out all of the odd numbers, and we just had the even numbers, we took out half of the numbers, well, just the odd numbers alone, or even numbers, whichever half you want to take, is still going to be infinitely long. Think about that. You can go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and that line of numbers is also going to go on for infinity. So it seems like when you multiply infinity by a half, you also then get infinity. So then, to finish the expected utility calculations, we need to add that together with the 1. So infinity plus 1 is going to be infinity as well. So the expected utility calculation for believing in God is going to amount to infinity. And since infinity is greater than 2, the decision matrix is going to tell us that it's more rational for us to believe in God than for us not to believe in God. So one way to push back on this argument is to challenge the way the matrix was filled in. There are a range of possible outcomes and options. And you might think that the way we filled it in is a little bit differently. Maybe you think that the likelihood of each of the outcomes is different. Or maybe you think that the relative goodness and badness of each of the eventualities is different. And so maybe you think that we filled in the matrix incorrectly. So we'll get to different ways of filling in the matrix and different ways of adjusting the matrix, but before we get to that, we need to preemptively, head off an objection that you might be thinking about. So you might be thinking about infinity, and you might want to reject this argument based on the use of infinity in this argument and say it's really difficult for us to make decisions about things that have infinite quantities. And so we shouldn't be using decision matrix to make these decisions when there are infinite quantities involved. However, think about this. If I were to give you the option of choosing between a movie gift certificate, or I don't know if you guys remember Movie Pass. That was a little credit card where they, you had infinite amount of movies, and so it's like you can get a gift certificate from AMC to go see 20 movies, or you can get this Movie Pass, which is unlimited movies forever and ever and ever. And it's like, which one of those would you choose? And it's like, even if you don't like movies, it's pretty clear that you should choose the infinite amount of movies. 'Cause it's like, in the rest of your life, someone who doesn't like movies could still easily go see another 20 movies. So, and 21 movies. And if you only choose the 20 pack, then you're going to have to pay for that 21st movie. But if you have an infinite amount, then you'll get it for free. So clearly, we can ration with infinity options, and we can do so using a decision matrix. So one possible objection is that the decision matrix overestimates the probability of God existing. As we set up the original matrix, it was 50-50, but maybe you think that it's extremely unlikely that God exists. But still, there's like a remote possibility. It's not going to be zero, right? Maybe it's 0.1 or 0.001 or 0.00001, but it's really not going to make a difference. So we'll just put it as 1% now as opposed to 90%. And the reason that, we're giving it 1% or just at least some percentage as opposed to none is the idea of like, God existing isn't going to be as like contradictory as something like the idea of finding out that there's a round square. You'd be way more surprised to find out that there's such a thing as a round square than you would be to find out that God exists, right? So that's why we're going to put it as only 1% for right now. But again, you can make it even lower. It's not really going to make a difference. All right, so now we've adjusted the probabilities. Let's look at the decision matrix. And you can see that it's slightly changed the expected utility calculations, but not enough to make a difference. You have now have slightly more of a reason to not believe in God, but that's still going to be dwarfed by the infinite expected utility of infinity. Yeah. The point is that as long as there's a possibility that God exists, then the argument for BG2 is still going to work. So you might be thinking that believing in God is not going to be enough to get you into heaven to reap that infinite reward. Not only do you have to believe in God to get into heaven, but you also have to be a good, faithful person who lives a moral life. So to account for this, we need to add more rows for the different choices that we're going to have in our lives. So you have the options of believing in God and being good, and you have the options of believing in God and being bad. So now that we have a new row, we also need to adjust our eventualities, and we need to redo our rankings of those eventualities. So we give a 1 to the eventuality in which you don't believe in God, and yet he does exist. Again, that's the idea that you're going to go to hell. Presumably, God would also punish the badly behaved believer on the assumption, but maybe not as bad as the atheist, because they at least believed, so that's going to be slightly better. So we give that one a 2. And then we've scored being an atheist in a godless world as a 5, again, assuming that you get to live that lifestyle and not be punished for it. And that's going to be higher than being a badly behaved believer in a godless world because, I don't know, you made some commitment to something that doesn't exist, and so it's slightly less off. And then we've ranked both of those ahead of being a well-behaved believer in a godless world. And that's again because you would have spent all of your time going to church and living all this upstanding lifestyle that you didn't really have to do. And then finally, the eventuality in which you are a well-behaved believer and God does exist still gets that infinite amount, since you will go to heaven and you will get it will be infinitely better than all the other eventualities. So the matrix tells us that being a well-behaved believer is going to be preferable or give us better expected utility than being a poorly behaved believer or a non-believer at all. So we can adjust the numbers all we want in this decision matrix and try and change things, but it's really not going to change anything, because as long as one of them is going to have an infinite reward, then that one is always going to be preferable to the other one. So since being a well-behaved believer gets that infinite reward, that one is always going to have the highest expected utility. And it's always going to be higher than a poorly behaved believer and a non-believer at all. You might challenge the idea that God gives his followers an infinite reward. After all, how can we be confident that heaven is infinite? The idea is, if there's no guarantee that heaven is infinite, then there's no guarantee that the expected utility calculations for believing in God are going to be infinite. And thus, there's no guarantee that the expected utility calculations are going to always favor believing in God. But that's not exactly the right way to be thinking about this. Instead, we don't know whether God is generous or God is stingy and only gives people a finite amount of reward in heaven. Since we're unsure and we don't really know whether God is stingy or generous, we should just add another column to the possible outcomes, a stingy God and a generous God. So we can look at our new decision matrix here with our extra column of generous God and stingy God. And now with the new column, we need to add another set of eventualities and rank them. So the eventuality in which you are a believer in God and God turns out to be stingy, we can put that as 1,000,000 points to reflect the idea that this is still many orders of magnitude better than the next possible eventuality, in which you are a non-believer and yet God does not exist. Again, the exact numbers here aren't really going to be important. But again, since believing in God gives you the possibility of infinite rewards, then the decision matrix is still going to tell us that believing in God is preferable to not believing in God. So maybe getting into heaven isn't simply believing in God, but it's believing in the right God. And if you believe in the wrong God, then you're going to be sent to hell. This again means that the decision matrix is oversimplified. We need to add more rows to account for the believing in different gods, and we need to add more columns to account for the outcomes of different gods existing. So now we can represent that in this new decision matrix. And now we've done our best to fill in the different probabilities and finite eventualities. And if you like, you can expand the matrix to still include even more possible gods. This should really not affect the argument either way. So now you should notice that there is a tight expected utility between believing in the Christian God and believing in Zeus. But still, notice that the decision matrix tells us that believing in some God or other is preferable to not believing in God at all. Hence, BG2 is still going to be true. Believing in some God or other is going to have a higher expected utility than not believing in God. So we can keep going on to try and adjust the matrix to see if we can get the expected utility calculations to change, but hopefully you can see by now that adjusting the matrix really isn't going to change very much. Believing in God is always going to have the higher expected utility than not believing in God. So instead of adjusting the matrix again, let's go on to continue a different kind of objection. Let's suppose that now you're completely convinced by this argument. You should believe in God. So you close your eyes, and you clench your fist real tight, and you're like, believe in God, believe in God, believe in God, and nothing happens. And so that you might think tells us that, oh, this belief is not really voluntary. And we can't really just choose what we believe or not believe. And so this suggests that the argument is going to be ineffective. Ineffective in the sense that if the point of the argument is to convince you to believe in God, then the argument can't do that. It can't get you to believe in God. So this is going to threaten BG1. The idea is that, if you should choose the option the decision matrix gives you, this implies that you have an ability to do so. Since you don't really have an ability to choose, what you believe and what you don't believe, then maybe you shouldn't be using the decision matrix to help you make this choice. I think the idea is maybe you shouldn't be using the decision matrix to help you make decisions about what to believe or not believe. Maybe you should use the decision matrix for, actions you can or can't do. Like, remember talking to your crush or not talking to your crush. Those are actions. Those aren't beliefs. But again, the problem is that, you're not just sitting there thinking really hard is not the way of changing your beliefs. we can change our beliefs. It's just, not a matter of like instantly thinking, oh, now all of a sudden I believe this. The way we change our beliefs is through, intervention and, changing our actions and changing our lifestyles and all of these things that are going to lead to a change in your beliefs. So think about like alcoholics, like they have no control over whether they have intense cravings for alcohol, but that doesn't mean that they can't, get over those cravings eventually. Or maybe not completely over them, but there is ways of mitigating them, like checking into rehab or steering clear of, their old haunts, the bars they used to go to, or the friends they used to drink with. Avoiding those things are going to help them, not drink, do the thing that they want to do. Other options are like joining AA programs. So we can change our beliefs indirectly. We can, especially about God too, we can go to church, we can start reading some scriptures or other holy religious literature. We can surround ourselves with the smartest theists that we know, the most inspirational believers, and we can steer clear of atheists. And in so doing, we're likely to, start believing these things. We're gonna, likely start living that lifestyle. Another option is that, there are people all the time who, non-believers who have found the Lord. And so all you have to do is, find one of them, find one of their biographies, read about it, figure out how they did it, and just try and follow their lead to find the Lord. So even though you might think that belief isn't voluntary, isn't still going to be an objection here. You still have the ability to indirectly affect our beliefs with the environment we're in or the people we're surrounded by. So I've been arguing that when faced with the decision between believing in God and disbelieving in God, that based on our expected utility calculations, you should believe in God. Now, I've explained how to set up our expected utility calculations, why they work, how how we use them regularly, all that stuff. And then I applied that and set up the argument for believing in God. So you might have thought, okay, maybe we got the probabilities wrong. Maybe it's extremely unlikely that God exists, but that didn't affect the argument at all. And then maybe it's just not enough that we believe in God, but we also have to be good people. Again, that's not going to affect the argument either. Maybe it was that God only gives out a finite reward for heaven, but again, still believing in God had the higher expected utility. Finally, we considered that maybe there are a lot of gods to choose from, and you have to believe in the right God in order to get into heaven. And then we also considered the objection that belief isn't voluntary, but we showed that, yeah, you can indirectly change your beliefs. All right, so in the end, this is arguing that, we have pretty good reasons to bet on the existence of God. All right, so now let's think about some reflection questions before you guys come into class. So for all we know, disbelieving in God or believing in the wrong God will result in going to hell. Or something like enduring an infinite punishment, like the opposite of heaven, so an infinitely long, bad eternal life. How might introducing negative infinity affect the decision matrices on betting on God? 2, for all we know, the reward, God only rewards those who believe in Him for wholesome reasons. So the idea is that you won't get rewarded for just believing based on your decision matrix. You have to believe in God for non-interested reasons. You have to believe in God for God's sake to get into heaven, to receive that reward. So if that's the case, then how might that be used as an argument to push back against BG2? All right, number 3, and again, for all we know, there is no God, but rather an evil deity who punishes believers and rewards atheists. If that were the case, how might that, be used to make another argument against BG2? So we also considered that there are, the objection that there are many gods to choose from. So maybe we could also adjust that objection and say that there is infinitely many gods to choose from, and then think about how that might affect the argument. All right, so then finally, suppose that you are given the opportunity to enter a lottery. And if you entered the lottery, then you win a credit card with unlimited spending for anything and always, everywhere it's accepted, no matter what. So essentially, you just get unlimited money to do whatever you want with it. So the thing is that to enter this lottery, though, it's only 1,000,000 to 1 chance that you're going to win. And the cost of the lottery ticket is going to be every last dollar you have and every worldly possession you have. Now, do you think it would be rational to enter that lottery? If the answer is no, then that might be an argument against BG1 there. All right, so these are a couple different things to be thinking about, and I want you guys to reflect on them before we come to class. And yeah, I'll see you guys there.